And I rise today to speak in support of the National Security Supplemental Appropriations Bill that is the business before this body. After a disappointing failure to move ahead with a bill that included critical border security provisions, we now have before us a chance to pass and send to the House a bill that would invest tens of billions of dollars. The men and women of Ukraine who continue to fight tirelessly in the depths of winter on the front lines of freedom. To spend billions more on coming to the aid of Israel as it continues to battle Hamas, and $10 billion invested in humanitarian aid that will provide critical support to those facing starvation and deprivation in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Somalia, and a dozen other countries around the world, and to invest in our partners in the Indo-Pacific. It is absolutely critical that we continue to fund Ukraine's response to the brutal Russian invasion. In 2014, Russia invaded and seized Crimea, but it's in 2022 that Putin sent in hundreds of thousands of soldiers to attack Ukraine from the north, from the east, and to occupy 20% of Ukraine's land. Many predicted Ukraine would fall within a matter of days. Yet they still fight on bravely today, showing what is possible with faith and persistence, determination and perseverance, and the support of 50 countries from around the world. Our president has assembled a remarkable coalition, and together they have contributed more than we have to Ukraine's security and defense. I was in Europe at a conference just a few weeks ago. I traveled with my friend and colleague, Republican Senator Rounds of South Dakota. We went to Poland, to Slovakia, and to this conference in Switzerland where we met with leaders from all over Europe. I had the chance to meet with President Zelensky, with his foreign minister, defense minister, to hear about how their economy is reviving, how they're exporting more grain now than they did before the war, how with American investments through USAID, they've brought critical parts of their economy back. But I also heard that without these funds, without the munitions, without the budget support, without the humanitarian aid, President Zelensky predicted that Putin will ultimately win. I cannot imagine, I do not want to imagine, the tragedy that will befall Europe and our place in the world should we allow this to happen. Putin will only stop when we together stop him. When we were in Poland, Senator Rounds and I heard loud and clear from their leadership the confidence that if Putin were to succeed in ultimately subjugating the Ukrainian people, he will be knocking on the door of Poland, our NATO ally, next. Just last week here in the Capitol, I met with the speakers of the parliaments of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, 3 Baltic states long occupied by the Russians, by the Soviets, today free, and members of NATO. Their leaders are convinced that should Putin be allowed to succeed in Ukraine, they will be next. His forces will be knocking on their door. And folks, to be clear, either we come to their defense at scale and in force and with American troops, or NATO is dead and our role as leader of the free world is over. I've listened here on the floor and in person, on television and at caucus lunches and at meetings, as my Republican colleagues have said over and over that they support Ukraine strongly. Now we have a chance to prove it and to show it. I had the honor of taking the Liberty Medal from the National Constitution Center to Kyiv with our former colleague, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, now retired. It was a harrowing but uplifting journey, a chance to meet with President Zelensky and his whole core national security leadership team. To get into his office is quite a journey through a maze of tunnels and sandbags of larger and larger men with more and more severe weapons in darker and darker corridors. But to see the spirit and the determination, the persistence with which Zelensky, his team, and their troops and the people of Ukraine continue this fight is to be challenged to your very soul, to know what it looks like when people who have tasted freedom are willing to risk their very lives to defend their country from the aggressions and the predations of the Russians. I don't need to tell you but it is probably worth repeating that the horrific human rights violations committed by Russian troops against Ukrainian civilians must also be answered. I had the chance to meet with Ukrainian refugees, both in Kyiv on that former trip and in Poland just a few weeks ago, and to hear from Ukrainian women what was done to them, what happened to their husbands, to their children, to their hometowns, is a reminder of the savagery of this war and the necessity of our standing firm with Ukraine. Ukraine is running out of ammunition and running out of time. And the hope that they have in the United States as the nation that is the indispensable country leading the free world will run out if we fail to come to their defense at this moment. I'll close with something that I heard from my parents when I was a child. There was a song popularized on the radio not long after Pearl Harbor. And in this song, a chaplain is reflecting on what he saw and what must be done next. The lyrics of the song go, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free." And this song by Frank Lesser, penned by an American not long after we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, he concludes, "I can't afford to be a politician. We're all between perdition and the deep blue sea. So praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free." To the men and women of this Senate, I can only hope and pray that you will pass the ammunition forward to those who stand on the front lines of freedom, who are facing relentless Russian attacks, and who even today in the depths of winter watch the debates on this floor to see whether this nation will stand, whether we can be counted on. When our president says we will be with you to the end, that commitment must mean something. We must pass this supplemental.
Will the senator yield for a question?
Absolutely. I yield.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe the senator is also considering attending the Munich Security Conference.
I am.
As am I. And for those unfamiliar with that conference, leaders from around Europe and around the world gather to discuss the current state of affairs when it comes to security.
Yes.
And if we are there, we are bound to be asked as a first question, just what is the United States' position on the defense of Ukraine?
We will.
Has the senator come up with an answer?
The answer will be given by this body in the coming few hours and days. Because I went to Europe with my friend and colleague, Senator Rounds, just a few weeks ago, and in Poland and Slovakia and at a conference in Switzerland gave the answer. We are confident we will fund Ukraine. Today, I am not certain. And in this question, in how we answer it, in how this body acts, hangs the answer to whether the United States continues to lead the free world or is willing to be America first, America alone, and surrender to Putin.
As a student of history, I'm sure the senator remembers, as I do, the lengthy ordeal when the British came to us before World War II and begged us to come to their assistance. And we waited and we waited. We came up with an alternative, Lend-Lease and other things, but we didn't commit until that fatal day, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and we were drawn into the war. Can the senator think of a time in history when the United States has walked away from an ally fighting for its life?
Not with the significance and severity of this moment, for a couple of reasons. One, because all of the world is engaged in watching or in supporting. As I mentioned before, 50 nations are contributing munitions, financial support to Ukraine's fight. This is as global a fight as we've had since, well, the Second World War. And the clarity of the aggression by Russia against a sovereign, peaceful nation that in no way precipitated this conflict is as sharp and clear as any conflict in our lifetime. I cannot imagine the consequences for our reputation, not just at a conference in Europe, but in history, were we to abandon Ukraine now.
I'd like to ask the senator through the chair again. In this circumstance, we have seen the revival, in my estimation, of an alliance which was so important 50 or 60 years ago and now is critical, and that is the NATO alliance. We've seen not only the strength of that alliance, but We've seen nations like Finland and Sweden announce that they wanted to be part of that alliance in its future. What does it say of the NATO alliance if the leading nation, the United States, walks away from Ukraine?
I think that would weaken the United States. I think it would weaken NATO. I think it would weaken the whole concept of collective security. The Finns and the Swedes have a long history in this region. The Finns know better than any nation what it means to stand alone against Russian aggression, to fight hard, to stand tall, and to push them back. Their memory of the Winter War of 1939-1940 is critical to their national identity, and they have a capable and sophisticated military. The Swedes were a regional power, a dominant military centuries ago, but they remained neutral even in the Second World War. For the Swedes and Finns to see Russia's aggression against Ukraine and extend their hand to all of NATO and say, we want in, shows that they appreciate the significance of this moment. By adding Finland to NATO, we have doubled Russia's border with NATO. We've brought into NATO two very capable nations and militaries, but we've also increased, I think, our moral commitment to stand firm and to stand strong. NATO has only invoked Article 5 once in our defense after the attack of 9/11, and NATO came with us for 20 years to Afghanistan. I've stood with the leaders of countries most Americans don't think about every day. Take, for example, Denmark, a small nation that fought alongside us for decades in Afghanistan, that lost dozens and dozens of their soldiers. They met their pledge for collective security in NATO. We need to honor that pledge.
My last question, of course, relates to the aftermath if we abandon Ukraine. I have a special connection and affection for the Baltic nations, as well as Poland, which is so ably represented in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. We're very proud of that fact. What does it say to those countries who are literally in the sights of Putin as the next victim if we walk away from this situation in Ukraine?
It says to the people of Poland, to the people of Lithuania, to the people of Latvia, to the people of Estonia, nations that long knew the boot of Soviet occupation and oppression, that they should be afraid, that they cannot count on the United States, that they must provide for their own security. In the trip I just took to Poland, Polish leadership said even though there's been a change in their election, they will not change. They are committing 4% of their GDP to their national defense, the highest of any NATO nation. They're welcoming Americans to participate. As you well remember, my colleague from Chicago, from Illinois, we went to Poland and we went to Lithuania together just before Russia launched its second broad-scale invasion of Ukraine. We saw Americans training alongside Poles at the Wask Air Force Base. We saw Americans training alongside other Baltic nations right on the border with Belarus. And then the war began. The sense of the urgency of history was thick in the air as we got on a flight to come back to the United States, as the missiles and bullets were flying, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine began at full scale, and we did not know what would happen. In every meeting, in every conversation, the folks we met with, Senator, said it was crucial that the United States be the guarantor of NATO, be the backbone of this collective alliance that has kept us safe and free. And with one last reference to history, the one previous time America first was a watchword spoken across this nation was in 1939 and 1940, when Charles Lindbergh, a respected aviator, joined a nationwide isolationist movement to say we should stay out of the wars of Europe. As you ably pointed out, the lesson was nearly tragic. As Hitler's armies advanced across Europe without the United States coming to the rescue of our allies, we waited, and we waited, and we waited until Japan attacked us. It's only because Germany declared war on us that we got in the war in Europe. We waited too long. We could have saved millions of lives. We could have stopped the march of Nazism years before it got out of control. Many of us were raised on the lessons of that chapter of our history. We should not forget them now.
I thank my colleague.
Thank you. To conclude on this point, the lessons of history are thick not just in this chamber, where the debates that formed NATO took place. not just in the capitals of Europe, but around the world, where other authoritarians are watching to see whether we will stand, whether we will defend, and whether we can be counted on. We must pass this supplemental. Thank you, Mr.